coming here to be here at 8:30, 9:15 in the morning. I don't usually talk before 10 a.m., so this is quite a change for me. I changed what I was going to talk about at the very last minute, like 2 days ago. I was going to talk about poetry, but I decided to talk about the language of poetry. People are always telling me they don't get poetry, they don't understand poetry, they don't read poetry, people who aren't poets. And I don't believe this is true. So this was me playing t-ball, which I also don't like. And this is how I feel when people tell me they don't like poetry. Also, you guys, I've never made a PowerPoint in my entire life until now. Let me see if I get this. When people tell me they don't like poetry, this is how I feel. I think it's a bunch of horse shit. I think everyone likes poetry. Poetry is just a form of storytelling. In a way, poetry is kind of like a bastard form of language because we don't really know exactly where it comes from, how it's made. It's not quite meant to be understood. And I'm going to read something because I wrote a couple sentences that are really hard to memorize. Just thinking of language being a medium through which we express or experience a sense in an attempt to create meaning. Talking about language, which is what I'm going to do for the next 20 to 30 minutes, is interesting because I'm about to describe something that describes something that can't be described. And talking about the language of poetry is even trickier because poetry uses language to describe something that can't possibly be said in words. So we're going to do an exercise right now. And if you know, please don't spoil it for everyone. But for those of you who have not heard this story, do you know what a tipperau is? Has anyone heard of a tipperau? You have heard of a tipperau? What is it?
An ancient building from Pennsylvania.
Who told you that?
You told me that.
Okay, so,
You don't have to speak anymore, yes, I bet you do.
well, if you knew about it, you are supposed to. But yes, it is an ancient architectural structure. And I know what it looks like, and you're going to draw one right now. You've had coffee. Do you know what it looks like? Well, that sucks for you. I'll tell you what it looks like. But there are two rules. One, you have to draw it with your eyes closed, and I can see all of your eyeballs right now, so I can tell if you're cheating. And two, once I begin the instructions, you can't talk, and you cannot open your eyes. It's really hard to keep them closed, because you're going to want this thing to look sexy and beautiful. Okay, you guys ready? Close your eyes. So a tipperau, this building, the basic structure, everybody ready? The basic structure of this building is a rectangle wider than it is long. Keep your eyes closed. On the right side of this rectangle is a tower, something similar to what you'd see in a cathedral, taller than the rectangle. It has a triangular roof. On the left side of this rectangle is a similar tower, but it's taller. This building is not symmetrical. In the middle of this rectangle is a large arched doorway. Laughing is okay. If you get confused and want to ask me what the last step is, don't. I'm not giving A's or F's, or 10s or 0s. In the middle of this large arched doorway is a circular window. This window in the middle of the door has vertical bars like something you would see in a prison. Halfway between this door in the center of your structure and the right tower is a square window. And halfway between the center door and the left tower is a square window. Around this entire structure, and for the people who walk in late, they're going to be like, what the fuck is going on? Around this entire structure is a moat or a circle of water. Do not put a bridge over this water. This is a completely isolated building. Let me see these beautiful drawings. Hold them up. Show everybody. Show everybody. Turn them around. Oh my God, that one's three-dimensional. That's a first. Okay, so basically, do you know why you didn't know what it was other than the woman in the back of the room? Because I made it up. It does not exist. You can look in any dictionary. I checked. I spelled it correctly my way. But it didn't matter, right? Usually here in Romania, I tell people it's a Macedonian structure just in case. But this is what writing is like. Actually, this is not what writing is like. This is what any creative process is like. And it starts with language. Any kind of language. This time it started with a word, and you didn't understand this word. But you were still able to create this object, this world, this entire picture, and now, because brains are fucking awesome, you know Tipper out, and you probably won't forget it. This is what writing is like, and this is what creative writing is like. And you weren't embarrassed to show these to anyone, were you? Not that much. Why?
We knew that all of them sucked.
You guys talk, I love it. But why don't you care that it sucks?
Because everyone's
Because you did it with your eyes closed, it can't be perfect. If I said draw it again with your eyes open, it would look probably a lot more refined. It would be like a second draft. First drafts are shitty. And this is the thing. A lot of people think that they don't have voice when they write. A lot of young writers worry about this, and none of yours look the same. So I like to use that exercise just to kind of, it's an analogy of the writing process. So I like this quote by Elizabeth Bishop. She says that the three qualities she admires the most in poetry are accuracy, spontaneity, and mystery. I think poetry has a logic of memory. I think it's also like dreams, and I think it's a lot like calculus. And you might be like, oh shit, we're gonna have a math lesson, but we're not. But if you think about an asymptote, does anyone know what that is? If you think about a line that's continually, always continually approaching a given curve, or a curve approaching a given line, or a verse approaching something at stake, but it never quite reaches it. We're talking about limits here. We're talking about things at stake. So poetry has things at stake. I'm teaching in Brașov, creative writing in English. Pot să vorbesc în limba română, nu foarte bine, dar poate o să fie foarte amuzant, fără să vreau, so I speak English. So I'm going to put this down for a second. My students didn't know what at stake meant. This is also the thing with phrases in different languages. So this is what I did. I took a poem. I stabbed the poem with a stake. And I said, what happened to this poem? They didn't know how to describe at stake, but when I did this, then they said, oh, loss, danger, limit. Fuck yeah. Kids get poetry. I was sitting in a cafe in Brașov recently, and this little kid wandered up to me. I was typing, and she put her chin on my table, and she just looked at a poem that I was working on. And I said, știi poezie? And she said, da, îmi place poezie, știu poezie. Adults sometimes think they don't get poetry. This is me. If I were an orange, I would not have a very long life because people would eat me, so I don't want to be an orange. This was like second grade, and we had prompts in the subjunctive. If I were a crayon, I would not live very long because people would break me and throw me away. If If I were a sticker, I would still not have a very long life because people would chew me up and throw me on the ground. This is metaphor. And I didn't know I was doing this. Kids do this naturally. Somewhere along the line, though, they forget they know how to do it. So now I'm going to tell you my story about coming to poetry, and it revolves around 3 questions. Somebody asked me once, a professor, do you write poetry? And I'd always written in a journal, but I said no. And I said, maybe I write poetically, and he said, you should write a poem, and you should enter a contest. And I thought, but I don't know anything about poetry, so how can I write a poem? But I had just visited my sister, who has been in and out of prison for years and who is currently incarcerated long periods of time for minor offenses, because we have a problem in the US with mass incarceration. And I wrote a poem. I had no idea how to write a poem. And I'm going to read it to you, and I have it up here, because when you hear a poem and when you see a poem, they're 2 different experiences. Visiting Amber at Lowell Correctional. A windowless room. Mom and I remove shoes, socks, spread our arms wide between the cinder block wall and locked door. The guard takes a swallow of V8 before patting us down. Inside, I ask Amber if this is a maximum security facility. She tells me they've got her in here with murderers, like the gardener. Worked at a daycare, killed a few kids there, buried them alive. They gave her yard duty until she began to name the trees she planted. Josie, Maggie, Stephanie. Slicing deep into her thighs, she mortared her wounds with shit and got gangrene. In a wheelchair now. Don't want to think about her no more, Amber says. Seeing her every day is bad enough. An inmate takes Polaroids, $2 each, acrylic wall paintings in the background. One of an angel, feathers fanned out against a pastel sky. Stand here, Amber says. I want you to have wings. She's to my right, our mother to my left. We smile big. When I dream about my sister, she's a child in our Florida backyard, wide-eyed and silent. She fills buckets with garden snakes, catches strawberry-necked lizards poised with the want of a mate. With one hand, she holds a wriggling lizard. With the other, she hinges its jaws open, then closed onto the lobe of her ear. You can actually wear lizards as earrings like that. So I wrote this story because I didn't know how to write it any other way. And it won a prize. And it wasn't as polished as this because I edit like a motherfucker and I worked on it for 5 years. But I didn't show up to the award ceremony because I thought, I don't know anything about poetry. Question number 2 had to do with med school. Now this is where I tell you that I'm crazy because at this time, I was double majoring in English and Spanish, getting my pre-medical certificate in preparation for med school, getting a creative writing certificate, while at the same time recovering from a life-threatening illness. Yusef Kuminyaka, who is an American poet, very talented, very well-known, came to my school and gave a reading. And after the reading, during a Q&A session, somebody asked him, when did you first realize you were a poet? And I was about to take this MCAT, this 6-hour test that makes you never want to take a standardized test ever again. And he goes, well, I always knew I was a poet, but I thought that I needed to do something like study social neuroscience. And then he goes, but then there came a day when I realized I had to surrender to poetry. And I'm sitting there getting ready to take this test, and I thought, oh, shit. And then I applied to medical school, and I interviewed at my top choice. And I interviewed with a cardiac surgeon who was very full of himself, and I interviewed with a pathologist who had this incredibly large microscope in between us that was kind of like this wall. And all he wanted to do was talk about my poetry, and I thought, this is really weird. I'm trying to be a doctor. I didn't get in. And this happens sometimes. I was talking to my friend Gail over Skype a couple nights ago, and she said, not getting into med school was the universe saving your ass. And I'm not new agey or into talking about the universe too much, but I think it's kind of true. So question number 3 has to do with my friend's father, who was someone never recognized for his intelligence, one of the smartest people I've ever met in my entire life, didn't finish college, was a mechanic, then became an airline mechanic, and then walked into an office, this was when you could do that, and said, are you guys looking for pilots? And he became a Delta pilot. So this guy I listened to. And he said, well, you might just have to try like 3 or 4 more times. And I started crying. And then he felt really bad. So then he said, well, if you had to do just one thing for the rest of your life, what would it be? And instinctively, without a second's thought, I thought, poetry. And then I thought, wow, that's so stupid. You can't do poetry. So I said nothing. But this activated something that couldn't be undone. It was a realization. Realizations are tricky things, right? Because we're kind of late to them. Once we realize something, it's already happened. Love is like that. Pretty much everything is like that. Basically, my story of giving into poetry is about permission. Through these questions, I was given permission to allow myself to do something completely impractical, to devote myself to something that didn't make sense, that seemed impossible. When I gave into poetry, something really unexpected happened. I fell in love with teaching. And now I'm going to go back to the wisdom of children again, because kids aren't afraid of failure and they fucking say it like it is. When I grow up, I will be a teacher. If I were a teacher, my classroom would have lots of stuff in it. I would teach lots of stuff so that my class would be smart. So I became a teacher of creative writing, of lots of stuff. University students, elementary, middle, high school, and then prison. So teaching creative writing is like this impossible thing to do. Mostly you're unteaching. You're unteaching the way people have learned to feel about poetry, the way they've been taught, that it's this rigid, archaic thing that has to be understood one way, or like something that's in a glass box at a museum where you have to look at the little card that tells you one interpretation of it. People are afraid. The first day of class, I do the tip-arow exercise. It's the first thing I always do. Gets people laughing, makes them less afraid. People always have the same fears. Any kind of creative writing process, they're afraid they won't be able to express what they want to express. They're afraid they don't have a voice. They're afraid they aren't creative. They think poetry equals iambic pentameter, but they don't know what iambic pentameter is. This is another oh shit moment. Because we're taught, you guys have probably been taught iambic pentameter, right? How?
Oh, shit.
Yeah, because you know me. Sometimes tapping on your thighs, sometimes tapping on a table, or sometimes you're just watching a teacher make these weird little marks on the board, like adding diacritics that you don't know how to pronounce. And you think it's this every other syllable thing. But no, it's just a way to express something that we naturally do all the time, right? So if you break it down to colloquial terms, and you guys are lucky because you don't have any space, but I always make everybody get up with me, and we do iams by cursing. And we limp around the room, and we go, oh shit, oh shit, oh shit. And they think I'm crazy, but they get it. Or you could be like, oh shit, and that's a trochee. But you don't need to know these technical terms, which goes back to being able to write poetry without understanding the technical terms. We don't necessarily know, we're not thinking about how we're using gerunds or past participles when we're using them. We just use them. Which brings me to the art of losing isn't hard to master. I began teaching in prison this year, and you don't end up teaching in prison for no particular reason. My sister taught me how important writing is, and we all know how important writing and art are. Writing in particular, poetry in particular in prison, can really make or break your day. So I started teaching in prison, at a women's prison. And I wrote a line of iambic pentameter on the board, and someone goes, "Who taught you that?" And then we did the oh shit thing. And then we talked about a lot of exercises, and before I knew it, they were writing villanelles, form poems about things they were obsessed with, things that they couldn't have, simple things like making a meal, hugging somebody, things like that. Things that mattered, things at stake. No puppy poems. Poetry also brought me to Romania, where now I'm literally learning a new language. And now is where I tell you about my weird last name, which somebody thought that I changed the C to a K to make it sound like a cool author name. My great-grandparents on my dad's side emigrated from the Transylvania region in the early 1900s. My dad grew up with this culture. I did not. He did not speak Romanian. But he always tried to make us these strange pancakes when I was a kid, and they always looked like crap. They were like kind of thin and filled with little bits of fruit and sometimes kind of rolled up or folded, and he always made cabbage. And he always told me great stories about his grandparents. And everything I write comes from experience. And I got this poetry fellowship, which gave me the opportunity to travel for the first time in my life, and I had to pick somewhere I didn't know the language, where I had never been, and where it would inspire me to write. So I bought plane tickets to Romania with this fellowship money, and then again, the theme of the morning, I thought, oh shit, I don't know anybody, I don't know anything, I know Bună ziua, and then this magical thing happened right before I arrived. A friend of a friend in Boston was so excited, she was from Romania, she was a doctor, that I was excited about her country, and she invited me to come with her. I met her in Rome, and I stayed 2 weeks with her family. And now this goes back to language. They didn't speak English, this family. This woman stayed for like 2 or 3 days and left, and it was me with an English-Romanian dictionary and a Romanian-English dictionary, and this beautiful family. The mother was a teacher, is a teacher, and the daughter was 10 years old. And every day I played with a 10-year-old daughter, and we rode our bicycles to the park, and we played football. And they knew I was older and that I was kind of weird and didn't understand them, but they just treated me as if I were one of them. And I learned one of the most enriching things about language and poetry in my life, playing football in this village with these kids. Because one day, this one little boy was running like hell, and he jumped up to score a goal, and he flew in the air and fell on his arm, and I thought he broke his arm. And I was the only adult there, and I didn't know what to do. And then we realized that he was okay, and then he realized he was okay, but he was crying. And all the little kids huddled together in a circle, and I'm like, what are they doing? And they started pointing to different parts on their body. And they were pointing to where they had hurt themselves in the past, where they had scars that had healed and now were visibly faint. And I thought, being an outsider and watching this, it was like being a reader, and this was poetry. And I still have not figured out how to put this in a poem, but I will. So I'm almost done. We're going to take a minute now to think about the language of poetry. You guys have the other half of the paper? I want you to think about, I did this exercise with my class recently, and last night I got an email response to a blog post, and someone was like, that was a really great exercise you did with those children. So we're going to be kindergartners right now. I want you to think about poetry in particular, the language of poetry. But I don't want you to think about any words. I want you to think about what it means to you, and I want you to do something to that sheet of paper, anything, right now, that represents that. How you feel about poetry. What poetry means to you, what the language of poetry means to you. Do something to your paper. about copy? And when you're done, hold it up. Oh, but some of you have words. This is a no-word game. Because we're using language. This is language. It goes back to poetry, expressing something that can't be said in words, right? It gives you a feeling, but not just a feeling. You're not just relating. It's challenging you. It's something you don't understand. See, look at you guys all have different things. Somebody made a hat. And this is why you can't lump poetry into one particular genre. I watch a lot of interviews and read a lot of interviews with writers, mostly because of one thing. I'm really interested in process, and I like to find out when people lie. People always ask, how do you write blank? How do you write a poem? How do you write a story? And the honest writers, do you know what they say?
I don't know.
Yes, they say, I don't know. So I found this video the other night. I watched it over 30 times. It really made my night. I'm going to leave you with two things. And this is how I feel every time I begin a poem. Can we just watch that one more time? He's like, oh shit, what am I doing? Why did I start doing this? Oh my god, fuck this, fuck this. Oh, I'm done. I did it. And maybe it was acting except for the shovel toss. That looked real. So, when you tell me you like poetry, that's how I feel. And the moral to the talk, if there was one, and there is that we never know what we're doing, and we shouldn't. Because if we knew exactly what we were doing when we start any kind of creative process, we are going to make boring work that no one wants to read, we are not going to challenge ourselves, and we are not going to challenge the reader or the viewer. And you know what? You guys get poetry. I think you're poetry people.